Order, please. We will commence with the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable the Member for Hants East.
Beg leave to table a petition on behalf of the residents of my constituency. The operative cause, due to the deplorable, dangerous conditions of Route 215 and in light of the volume of traffic consisting of local, tourist and business traffic year-round, we, the undersigned, do request the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal rebuild Route 215 from exit 10 on Highway 102 through to Knoll and along the Fundy Shore, commencing in the spring of 2009. This would provide a safer route for residents of East Hants, support and sustain the tourist industry, and provide an acceptable route for business. And Mr. Speaker, there's a little over 1,000 signatures, and I've affixed my signature in support.
There's a vote for it. Watch it right there, Sean.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Oh yeah, right on.
Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to table a petition on behalf of the Chebucto Wilderness Coalition. The operative clause being, we the undersigned call upon the Nova Scotia Government to designate as a protected wilderness area the continuous block of approximately 9,800 hectares of public lands on the Chebucto Peninsula within the boundaries of Highways 103 and 333 in the County of Halifax, Province of Nova Scotia, under the Wilderness Areas Protection Act, SNSC 27, as amended. Mr. Speaker, it has been signed by 564 individuals, and I have also affixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable the Member for Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table the following petition. The operative clause reading, whereas our roads have the right to be properly maintained, we the undersigned petition the Government of Nova Scotia to properly fix the Green Bay Road, the Petite Riviere Road, and the Italy Cross Road. For years, occasional patching on these roads has been done with the ruts and bumps reappearing each year. The current road conditions are unacceptable. The areas of Crescent Beach, Green Bay, and Petite Riviere are so important to the tourism business of our province, and with the deplorable condition of the roads, people are staying away. Also, the condition of the roads create a major expense to the automobiles of Nova Scotia tax-paying residents of these areas. Mr. Speaker, there are 250 names on the petition, and I have affixed my signature.
The petition is tabled. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I beg leave to enter a petition on behalf of the residents of McNally, Nolly, Beckwith, Armstrong and Shore Road, who request an upgrade to their road and guardrails. And there are 57 names assigned to this petition, and I have affixed my name.
Good one, Leo. Another vote.
The petition is tabled. Any further petitions? Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable the Minister of Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a letter on the reporting requirements under Section 43(2) of the Civil Service Act, and accompanying the letter will be the Order in Council number 2009-103 and the regulations cited as politically limited employees position exclusion regulations. And Mr. Speaker, I also circulated a letter to all members of the House as well prior to the sitting this morning. Thank you.
The report is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a report entitled The Evaluation of the Nova Scotia Small Claims Court, Final Report to the Nova Scotia Law Reform Commission by St. Mary's University.
The report is tabled. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas yesterday hundreds of residents of the Purcell's Cove and Herring Cove areas were forced from their homes as fire fanned by strong winds whipped through the HRM communities. And whereas the Canadian Red Cross is assisting those individuals and families evacuated from their homes at the William Spry Community Centre. Whereas hopefully rain today will provide a needed break for personnel from the HRM Fire Service, DNR Fire Service, police forces, and all who are doing their part to protect the community and help extinguish the blaze. Therefore, be it resolved, members of this House thank all these individuals for their heroic efforts to deal with this tragic wildfire and wish our firefighters well as they work to extinguish the fire and avoid any further destruction of homes and the natural areas of the community. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
And Mr. Speaker, I will be visiting the site later on today. Mr. Speaker, if I might be allowed to have an introduction.
Please do.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I would like all members to extend a very warm welcome to a very special visitor we have in your gallery here today. We have with us, Mr. Speaker, Commander Jose Kurtz, Mr. Speaker, and on April 6th, Mr. Speaker, Commander Kurtz became the 11th commanding officer of Her Majesty's Canadian ship Halifax, and she is the first female to command a major Canadian Navy warship. She is a native of Joliette, Quebec. She joined the Canadian Forces in 1988 and received her bridge watchkeeping certificate in 1991 and specialized in maritime navigation. She subsequently navigated HMC ships Nipigon, Ville de Quebec, and the Protector. She served as executive officer in HMCS Ville de Quebec from 2007 to 2009. And during this time, the ship participated in an anti-piracy escort mission and supported the World Food Program in Somalia. Please join me and Mr. Speaker and all members of the House in joining the Commander here with us here today. I also neglected in my introduction to also welcome Tim Dunn, who is our military advisor as well. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas just weeks ago, Canada celebrated another proud first. And whereas in April, in our own port, Commander Jose Kurtz took the helm of the warship HMCS Halifax, the first time a Canadian woman has assumed such a position. And whereas the Quebec native and now Halifax resident balances this significant promotion within our military with another important duty, being a parent. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House salute Commander Kurtz for this honour and her 19 years of military service, which led her to the position she holds today, all guided by the mission of our service personnel to serve and protect her fellow Canadians here and overseas. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for African and Nova Scotian Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Royal Canadian Mounted Police Corporal Craig Smith has been a lifelong advocate for African Nova Scotian communities. And whereas Mr. Smith is a dedicated public servant whose passion for his own heritage inspired him to write numerous publications outlining the hardship and accomplishments of African Nova Scotians. And whereas in February of 2009 he released the Ultimate African Heritage Quiz Maritime Edition to celebrate the 25th anniversary of African Heritage Month and to promote the important and widely under-recognized Nova Scotian milestones made by those of African descent. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Corporal Craig Smith on the release of his book and commend him for his dedication to preserving and promoting African Nova Scotian history. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the first floor of the News Building in New Glasgow became the new location of the Mental Health Services Community Supports for Adult Programs, and whereas the new brightly lit, roomy location for treating clients with mental illness provides room for computers, for use of computers, crafts, and other activities, and whereas the new space allows for much more flexibility in the program's 120 clients, half of whom regularly take part in the program offered at the site. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House of Assembly join me in congratulating Pictou County Health Authority on this beneficial development and on their dedication to adults who need mental health services. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Eastern Fishermen's Federation is celebrating their 30th anniversary in 2009, and whereas the Eastern Fishermen's Federation has provided 30 years of providing leadership through information sharing, networking, and governance, and whereas the Federation has been a positive influence serving a diverse industry in factors such as geography, species, and history. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate the Eastern Fishermen's Federation and all its members on celebrating their 30th anniversary. And, Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas our crime prevention strategy supports government making investments in programs through community grants, so at-risk youth and citizens have access to recreational programs. Whereas the Department of Justice has funded 52 community organizations across the province since December of 2008. And whereas those community organizations deliver recreation programs so youth and other citizens are engaged in productive activities, therefore be it resolved that the representatives of these 52 organizations be congratulated on their continued success in making their communities safer for everyone. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health Promotion and Protection.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the week of April the 19th to 25th, 2009 is designated National Volunteer Week to recognize, celebrate, and thank Canadians who volunteer for various community initiatives and charitable organizations. Whereas the success of the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Nova Scotia would not be possible were it not for the 4,000 Nova Scotians whose volunteering efforts allow the foundation to undertake meaningful work in advocacy, health promotion, and research. Whereas 30 exceptional Nova Scotians have recently been awarded the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Nova Scotia's Volunteer Honour, the Outstanding Volunteer Award, by the Foundation's honorary patron, the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the significant contribution Nova Scotia's volunteers make to their community and congratulate the 30 volunteers who have received the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Nova Scotia's Outstanding Volunteer Award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Gaelic Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas May 1st marks the first day of Gaelic Awareness Month, celebrated throughout the province every May month since 1996. And whereas Gaelic language and culture represents one of the province's early languages and cultures, contributing to the rich fabric of the province through its language, music, storytelling, song, dance, place names, foods, and customs. And whereas the Gaelic community and Gaelic's presence contribute culturally, educationally, socially, and economically to that which constitutes the broader Nova Scotia experience. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize May 1st as Gaelic Awareness Month in the province and participate in opportunities throughout the month to learn more about Gaelic in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Military Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Royal Canadian Navy's principal responsibility during the Second World War was to escort the merchant ship convoys from Halifax to Europe, beginning September the 16th, 1939. And whereas Canada's Navy had neutralized the German U-boat threat by 1943. And whereas 24 Canadian naval ships were sunk during the war and approximately 2,000 members of the Royal Canadian Navy died, whose sacrifices will be recognized on Sunday morning during the annual Battle of Atlantic Sunday service at Point Pleasant Park's Sailors Memorial. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge the sacrifices, the achievements, and the victory by the proud members of the Canadian Navy during the Battle of the Atlantic. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Agricultural College will hold convocation ceremonies today in Truro, and whereas Jeff and Deborah Moore are the founders of Just Us Coffee, and whereas Jeff and Deborah Moore will be honoured with honorary Doctorate of Laws for their commitment to fair trade business practices, sustainable agriculture and rural development. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Jeff and Deborah Moore for receiving honorary doctorates. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bridgewater Elementary School Principal Mark McLeod was named Outstanding Administrator by the Nova Scotia School Administrators Association, and whereas Mr. McLeod has been called a teacher's principal and a player's coach for the high level of support he offers his staff and students, and whereas he works with the utmost professionalism, even during the most difficult of circumstances, to ensure that his school is filled with an atmosphere of trust and comfort. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House sincerely congratulate Mark McLeod on winning this prestigious award and for being an outstanding community and school leader. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the trucking industry plays a major role in keeping Nova Scotia's economy on the move, if you got it, a truck brought it. And whereas the Nova Scotia Trucking Safety Association is committed to improving truck safety in the province, and whereas the association recently presented its annual Safety Excellence Awards in recognition of outstanding safety performance within the trucking industry, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House congratulate the following major award winners: Hillman's Transfer Limited of Sydney, Donald Wynot Trucking Limited of Danesville, Premier Van Lines of Dartmouth, Atlantic Tilt Board of Dartmouth, and CBI Health of Bedford for their efforts and achievements during last year. Keep on trucking. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by shifting gears. All those in favour signify by saying yes. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas hepatitis B and C can lead to serious liver damage, liver cancer, and the need for liver transplantation. And whereas in Canada, about 500,000 people are living with either hepatitis B or C. And whereas early diagnosis may allow infected individuals to benefit from treatment which may clear the virus, help lessen damage to the liver, and prevent the virus from spreading to others. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House join me in recognizing May as Hepatitis Awareness Month in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Eastern Canadian Fisheries Exposition was held in March of this year in Yarmouth, and whereas the first biennial Industry Achievement Award were presented during the Eastern Canadian Fisheries Exposition, and whereas the awards recognize individuals who have contributed to the betterment of the industry through volunteering or other outstanding contributions to their community and the fishing industry. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate Ashton Spinney, Henry Surratt, and Denny Moore, all from the Yarmouth County, for winning the biennial Industry Achievement Award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for African and Nova Scotia Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on January 16th, Jean Whalen was appointed Judge of the Family and Provincial Courts in Nova Scotia, and whereas Ms. Whalen, who will be based in Sydney, was a college instructor and most recently a senior Crown Attorney with the Nova Scotia Public Prosecution Service for close to 20 years. And whereas she is also a founding member of the Black Lawyers Association of Nova Scotia and was Vice Chair of the Race Relations Committee of the Nova Scotia Barrister Society, and is described as a passionate, wise woman whose diverse experience will serve her well in her deliberations. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Judge Jean Whalen on her appointment and wish her the best of luck in contributing to the fair and effective administration of justice in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas April 19th to 25 was the 24th year that National Soil Conservation Week has been recognized in Canada, and whereas soil conservation supports the sustainable crops, rangeland and woodlot production, and is also important to maintaining other resources such as water, air and wildlife habitat, and whereas the value of these soils to the Canadian economy can be equal to roughly $36.3 billion to the country each year. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House recognize National Soil Conservation Week. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health Promotion and Protection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the disappearance and control of many infectious diseases can be attributed to immunization programs, whereas the immunization is a cornerstone of public health and a priority for the Department of Health Promotion and Protection, whereas many lives have been saved, numerous illnesses have been prevented, and the benefits of immunization clearly outweigh the risks. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House Assembly endorse National Immunization Week, which runs until May 2nd, encourage all Nova Scotians to ensure their vaccinations are up to date, and recognize physicians and other medical professionals for their diligence in promoting immunization programs. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Chebucto on an introduction.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. With the establishment of Citadel High School on the Halifax Peninsula, the two previous high schools were closed, one of them being St. Pat's High School, located in my constituency. The school board chose to continue to use that building, and one of the purposes for which it uses it is to offer classes to adults in English as a second language. I'm happy to report that today we have a group of the adult students who are taking courses in English as a second language visiting us today to observe the proceedings in this House. We have 5 of the students accompanied by their group leader, Daniel McIntyre. They're in the West Gallery. I would ask the members of the House to give them a warm welcome as they observe our proceedings.
The Honourable, the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on February 28th, Morgan Culp of Brookside Junior High School in Hatchet Lake was named Chronicle Herald Halifax Regional Spelling Bee Champion. Whereas Mr. Culp waited a mere half-second before assuredly delivering the correct spelling of the winning word, discriminate. And whereas he traveled to Ottawa in April for the Canada Bee and is off to Washington, D.C. in May for the U.S. National Spelling Contest. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House sincerely congratulate Morgan on being named Halifax Regional Spelling Bee Champion and wish him good luck at the U.S. National Championships in May. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Environment.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the grade 4 students and staff at Brooklyn Elementary School in Sydney participated in activities to recognize Earth Day, and whereas their knowledge and understanding of environmental issues is helping to create a clean and green Nova Scotia, and whereas they do their part through recycling, composting, and picking up litter to keep their communities clean, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in congratulating grade 4 students and staff at Brooklyn Elementary for their good work to protect the environment. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas small claims court plays a vital role in Nova Scotia's justice system, and whereas an independent study recently conducted by St. Mary's University concluded that the Nova Scotia Small Claims Court is doing an excellent job of meeting its core objective of providing affordable, informal, and speedy access to justice, and whereas this report, which is supported by the Nova Scotia Law Reform Commission, marks the completion of a project that started more than 2.5 years ago. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the excellent result and congratulate those involved who work in the Small Claims Court. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas May is Caregivers Awareness Month, and more than a third of us provide care to another person, and whereas Caregivers Nova Scotia is holding the Halifax Caregiver Luncheon and the first Caregivers Expo next week, and whereas the Nova Scotia Partnership on Respite, Family Health and Well-being, with co-chairs from the Advisory Council on the Status of Women and the Disabled Persons Commission, have developed excellent resources and outreach for families. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House extend their appreciation to all caregivers across this province. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Minister for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 3 of the province's parks are celebrating anniversaries this year, including Waikagama Provincial Park, Inverness County on 50 years, Ellenwood Provincial Park, Yarmouth County on 40 years, and Valley View Provincial Park, Annapolis County on 40 years. And whereas these provincial parks have provided an opportunity for residents and visitors to Nova Scotia to explore and discover our nature, and whereas the contribution of generations of men and women who have helped with the development, management, and operation of our province's parks over the years is greatly appreciated. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House recognize the importance of our provincial parks, especially Waikagama, Ellenwood, and Valley View, as they celebrate such significant anniversaries. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. The Honourable, the Minister for Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
Bill 253, entitled an act to amend Chapter 293 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Motor Vehicle Act.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to provide dignity for seniors and establish options to allow them to remain in their own homes.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to provide dignity for seniors and establish options to allow them to remain in their own homes.
Bill 254, entitled an act to provide dignity for seniors and establish options to allow them to remain in their own homes.
Order that the bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill entitled an act to amend Chapter 345 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pipeline Act. Hey.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to amend Chapter 345 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pipelines Act.
Bill 255, entitled an act to amend Chapter 345 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Pipeline Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I beg leave to introduce an act entitled an act to amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
Bill 256, entitled an act to amend Chapter 92 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Consumer Protection Act.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce an act entitled, an act to create thousands of secure jobs in the manufacturing and processing sectors in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, order please. Order please. The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to create thousands of secure jobs in the manufacturing. Order please. The Honourable Member begs leave to introduce a bill entitled, an act to create thousands of secure jobs in the manufacturing and processing sectors in Nova Scotia.
Bill 257, entitled An Act to Create Thousands of Secure Jobs in the Manufacturing and Processing Sectors in Nova Scotia.
Order that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition.
I would like to beg your indulgence, if I can, Mr. Speaker. May I do an introduction before reading my resolution? I would like to introduce to the House in the West Gallery Mr. Melvin Harris. Mr. Harris is a constituent of mine. I consider him a friend of mine. Sometimes describe him as the last farmer in Cole Harbour, a guy who has been involved very much with the British Home Child Society and is joining us here today, first for this resolution, but also to observe some of what's going on in the House. Mr. Harris, welcome, and I'd ask the House to welcome you. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas between 1879 and 1948, approximately 100,000 British home children aged 4 to 15 arrived in Canada to work as indentured farm labourers and domestic servants until they were 18 years old. And whereas today it is estimated that there are 4 to 5 million descendants of the British home children living throughout Canada and the United States. And whereas in 2009, the millions of descendants of the British home children and those who are survivors will commemorate the 140th anniversary of the arrival of the first British home children in Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize a month in the year of 2009 as the month of the British home child. And Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas despite his repeated claims that he would never run a deficit, the Premier plans to do just that. And whereas the Premier figures that as long as this year's books are balanced, no one would care about the deficit which his government ran last year. Whereas by attempting to change legislation to cover up his mismanagement, the Premier has shown that he does not have the skills necessary to lead this province. Therefore, it be resolved that the Premier apologize to Nova Scotia for poor management of finances of this province and a subsequent attempt to cover up his shortcomings, and ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the sport of volleyball is the #2 participation sport in the world, with more than 1 billion players worldwide, and whereas the under-14 Tier 1 girls West Hants Wizards volleyball team placed 3rd out of 22 teams in the Nova Scotia Provincial Championship tournament held April 25th to 26th, with the Wizards under-14 Tier 1 team now moving ahead to play in the Canadian East Open Tournament in Moncton, May 8th to 10th. And whereas Olivia Parker of Newport, in playing with the Wizards, is just one of more than 500 million females playing the game on a worldwide basis. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this House of Assembly congratulate Olivia Parker on an outstanding season of volleyball. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Member for Hants East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas birds are our companions in this world, both in the backyard and in the wild, and whereas serious bird watching has assisted science with a high level of observation, recording, and cataloguing of various species by its enthusiasts, and whereas Ms. Rosalind McPhee of Shubenacadie was recently presented with a certificate of appreciation from the Nova Scotia Bird Society for her outstanding volunteer efforts in a wide variety of aspects relating to birding. Therefore, be it resolved, this House of Assembly congratulate Rosalind McPhee on her recognition from the Nova Scotia Bird Society and thank her for her contributions to this important field of natural outdoor activity. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver, notice, and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in this province, ER closures are a problem that just keeps getting worse, and whereas year-to-date emergency rooms have been closed in excess of 3,200 hours, double the number of hours closed last year. And whereas in a pre-election bid to earn support, the Minister of Health says that she is looking for solutions to the ER crisis, which would have been helpful months ago when she took over the portfolio. Therefore, be it resolved, the Minister of Health worked diligently to find meaningful solutions to the closure of emergency rooms in this province and not just election-style rhetoric. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Cape Breton Island is a place of many firsts where ideas take flight, and whereas Mabel and Alexander Graham Bell's contributions to Cape Breton include the flight of the Silver Dart, as well as the formation of the first Home and School Association in Canada, and whereas the Trans-Canada Highway 105, which
Order, please. Very difficult to hear the speaker. The Honourable, the member for Victoria the Lakes.
And whereas the Trans-Canada Highway 105, which stretches from the Cancel Causeway to North Sydney, the gateway to Newfoundland and Labrador, passes the beautiful village of Bedak, which is celebrating the 100th anniversary of the flight of the Silver Dart. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House approve the renaming of the Trans-Canada 105 as the Mabel and Alexander Graham Bell Way, in recognition of their tremendous contributions to Cape Breton, Canada, and the world. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Order, please. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas the staff and customers...
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Fairview has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas the staff and customers of the TD Canada Trust branch in the Bears Road Centre, Halifax, have for the past 17 years donated teddy bears to the local cancer treatment centre. And whereas the teddy bears are comfort bears that go to adults who are undergoing chemotherapy treatment. And whereas, as one of the volunteers said, everyone needs a bear, even if they don't realize it at first. Therefore, be it resolved that this House thanks the staff and customers of the TD Canada branch in the Bears Road Centre, Halifax, for their kind actions in providing support and comfort to cancer patients. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in anticipation of a general election, the Premier and his Minister of Natural Resources announced that they had bid on 21,000 acres of Irving-owned land. And whereas while the Premier and his Cabinet are withholding details of their bid, it seems strange that we now have the money to afford such a purchase.
Order, please. The Honourable, the member for Digby Annapolis has the floor.
And whereas in the past, the Minister of Community Service, the Minister of Natural Resources, the Minister of Environment, and the Premier himself have said that the funds were simply not available at this time. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier tell Nova Scotians whether or not this bid on the Irving lands is just another case of playing pre-election politics. No. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Hantsport's Kara Peterson has been named to the Nova Scotia Under-17 women's basketball team, which will play in the Canadian Summer Games in Charlottetown in August. And whereas Kara's phys ed teacher from grade primary through grade 9, Brenda Vandertorn, describes Kara as an incredible athlete. And whereas Nova Scotia's head coach, Scott Monroe, describes Peterson as a versatile player who hopes Kara will be a team leader when play gets underway on August 15th. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this House of Assembly compliment Kara Peterson of Hantsport on her development as a hoops star and wish her the Team Nova Scotia outstanding success this summer on Prince Edward Island. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Bill Henderson has recently been recognized as Pictou's Volunteer of the Year for 2009, and whereas Bill has been involved with many community organizations over the years, such as the Red Cross, the Food Bank, the Northumberland Fisheries Museum, the Pictou County Heritage Military Museum, and many others. And whereas Mr. Henderson's most recent undertaking is in acquiring a scale model of a park ship to be on display in Pictou in 2010, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Royal Canadian Navy. Therefore, be resolved this House of Assembly congratulate Bill Henderson on being recognized as Pictou's Volunteer of the Year 2009 and thank him for the fine work he does for both the town and the county of Pictou. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in the fall of 2008, the Premier of Nova Scotia had a choice to make. Would he act immediately or would he wait and play a game of wait and see? He chose to wait. Whereas while this government waited, jobs were lost and businesses filed for bankruptcy from one end of this province to the other. And whereas with each passing day it become abundantly clear that the Premier and his Cabinet have failed Nova Scotians, therefore it be resolved that the Premier explain to Nova Scotians why his government decided to wait 6 months before finally showing an interest in the state of the economy. And I'd ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in 1969, Dr. Carlisle Chow began his medical practice in Badek, and whereas Dr. Chow still continues his practice today, serving the medical needs of the people in Badek and surrounding areas, as well as contributing greatly to his community beyond his medical profession. And whereas, although he is not yet ready to retire, a special evening honoring Dr. Chow will be held on Thursday, May 7th in Badek. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate and thank Dr. Carlisle Chow for his 40 years of dedicated medical service to the area and wish him many more years of good health and happiness. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas fire broke out on Wednesday in the woods behind J.L. Ellerslie School in Spryfield and was assumed extinguished on Wednesday night, and whereas fire reappeared on Thursday and has been burning out of control since then, forcing the evacuation of hundreds of people and destroying an unknown number of homes in the capital city of Nova Scotia and attracting international attention. And whereas the Minister of Natural Resources believed as of 6:45 p.m. last night that 3 borrowed water bombers had arrived from New Brunswick, although as of 7:30 this morning, Mayor Peter Kelly stated that these water bombers were on their way. Therefore, be it resolved that this government, even at this late date, begin to take seriously its responsibilities as elected representatives and stop taking risks with the health and safety of its citizens.
Order, please. 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 The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
There's the real NDP there. There's the real NDP.
The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Colleen Pinkney, skip, and her teammates Wendy Curry, third, Karen Henniger, second, Susan Krillman, lead, and Judy Burgess, coach, from the Truro Curling Club, won the 2009 Canadian Senior Women's Curling Championship. Whereas the Colleen Pinkney rink went 10-1 in round-robin play and earned the championship with a 6-4 victory over British Columbia's Kathy Smiley. Whereas the Pinkney rink is the first from Truro to win a national senior curling title, and it is only the third for the province, the last being in 1987. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate Colleen Pinkney, Wendy Curry, Karen Henniger, Susan Krillman, and Coach Judy Burgess on winning the 2009 Canadian Senior Women's Curling Championship. Congratulate Colleen and Wendy for being first-team All-Stars and wish the team every success in the upcoming World Championship to be held in Russia. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Inverness South Fishermen's Association, the ISFA, has requested a meeting with the Federal and Provincial Minister of Fisheries in regard to quota allocations. And whereas the Area 12 Nova Scotia crab fishers requested a meeting with the Federal Minister, Neil Gailshea, supported by a letter from the Honourable Peter MacKay, Minister of Defence. And Minister Shea has opted not to meet with the ISFA. And whereas the Department of Fisheries and Oceans has also blocked the ISFA from making a presentation in Moncton, New Brunswick on March 11, 2009, and has not yet met with the Inverness South Fishermen's Association. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly encourage our Provincial Minister of Fisheries to convene a meeting inviting the federal counterpart and the Inverness South Fishermen's Association. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the North Colchester Mustangs, the senior boys basketball team from Tadmagush, recently captured their first Nova Scotia School Athletic Federation provincial championship, and whereas the team's success was credited to a basketball program that continuously develops the players and their strong commitment in the off-season, and whereas after capturing their fourth consecutive regional banner, the Mustangs have established themselves as one of the top small school programs in this province. Therefore, be it resolved, all members of this House congratulate the North Colchester Mustangs for this monumental accomplishment. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas St. Mary's Church in Lismore, Pictou County was established in 1834 by Highland Scots who had settled the area in significant numbers after several waves of immigration, the largest being in 1802. And whereas St. Mary's Church obtained its own charge as a parish in 1869 and was responsible for the creation of Lismore as the name of the community. And whereas St. Mary's Scottish Highland Church has continued to be the very heart of the community for many generations over its 175 years and maintains this role in the 21st century, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislative Assembly congratulate the people of Lismore and surrounding area and the many parishioners, both past and present, who have contributed to parish life and the preservation of one of the most historic Roman Catholic churches in Atlantic Canada. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas to pull off many successful school events, teachers, administration, and students rely on the assistance of dedicated volunteers. And on April 21, 2009, volunteer Amy Covey assisted the Tantallon Elementary School in their Marsville program. Whereas Marsville was an exciting, hands-on, minds-on, cross-curricular program promoting student inquiry, risk-taking, problem-solving, and team skills. Student teams simulated habitation of the Red Planet, designed a mission patch, researched and built model life support systems. Whereas after months of hard work, the students and staff hosted a link-up day on April 21st. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House thank Amy Covey for her leadership, dedication, and work with the young minds of the grade 6 students at Tantallon Elementary. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Devil's Island, located at the mouth of the Halifax Harbour near Eastern Passage, has a lighthouse that has been guiding local fishermen and other mariners for over 131 years and has played a significant role in the history of Eastern Passage. And whereas the Devil's Island Lighthouse Society was formed by Eastern Passage residents who are working to ensure that the lighthouse is retained and maintained as an operational navigational light. And whereas the Society has collected over 3,200 names on a petition that will be presented in the House of Commons in Ottawa, asking for the lighthouse to be protected under Bill S-215, the Federal Lighthouse Protection Act, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly support and encourage the efforts of the Devil's Island Lighthouse Society in their attempts to retain and maintain the lighthouse as an operational navigational aid to mariners. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Premier's likely slogan for the upcoming election, which he may or may not want, is proven record economy first, and whereas throughout his 3 years in office, the Premier and his government have proven that they cannot manage the government's finances, they have proven they cannot keep ERs open, and they have proven that they are not capable of running Nova Scotia's corrections program, and whereas it is very surprising that the Premier is willing to run a campaign on this proven record of failure. Therefore, be it resolved that the Premier and his campaign team tell Nova Scotians why they should support a poor proven record such as theirs. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
Did you ask for waiver? There has been a request for waiver? No. No? I hear several no's. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
A decent resolution now, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Truro branch of the Canadian Federation of University Women will hold its 45th book fair on May 29th and 30th, 2009. Whereas the book fairs of the Truro branch of the Canadian Federation of University Women have been very successful over the years, raising over $265,000. Whereas the funds raised from the book fairs have been used to provide awards to graduating high school and mature students. as well as assisting the Truro Music Festival, Truro Head Start, Third Place Transition House, Maggie's Place, Colchester Historical Society, and the Colchester East Hants Public Library. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate the Truro branch of the Canadian Federation of University Women on their 45th book fair and for the generous support they have provided to students in the community over those 45 years. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. Orders of the day. Government business. The Honourable The Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, last night in the emergency debate we had in this House in regards to the economy of Nova Scotia, there's a lot of criticism towards a program that's been used by this province for decades. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for Pictou East made mention of a pork barreling, and I think it was great disrespect to the people, staff in my office. It's a program, Mr. Speaker, that's used widely by business, and business people have told me how much it's meant to them, the jobs we saved and created the last number of years in regards to the IEF. Mr. Speaker will decide that. You'll decide, Mr. Speaker, whether this point of order or not. And Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that if the Honourable Member felt that strongly against this program, maybe he could explain why his constituency office called me on behalf of a constituent to ask how they could access funds through the IEF.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, I think it was more of a speech by the Minister than a point of order, but clearly when he tried to put a fine point on it, the reality is I suppose most members of this House would like to know how that secretive fund works. So I suppose that's more in trying to enlighten Nova Scotians than to do anything else. So, Mr. Speaker, it was just a matter of a partisan speech rather than a point of order.
The Honourable the Minister of Economic and Rural Development.
They do not have a clue in regards to the IEF, like anything else in this province. Not a clue of how that program works. Not a clue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlemen. Order, please. I do not believe it is a point of order. I do believe it is a disagreement between two members. Actually, it's a disagreement between a number of members, but we'll leave it alone. Yeah. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure there was another member on their feet. If they were speaking to that point of order, I had a new point of order, Mr. Speaker. So I would yield the floor to my honourable colleague if it's on the same point of order.
Oh, I believe it. Well, I already made my ruling on that last point of order, so it's over. It's a new point of order. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on a point of order. Yesterday in question period, in his supplementary question to me as Minister of Health, the member from Pictou East implied that our government had been dismissing the importance of the BTO program. In correspondence received at the Premier's office later that day from the Nova Scotia Division of the Canadian Cancer Society, they provided, and I quote, clarification and apology, re the question to Minister Casey, end of quote. That included, and I also quote, I didn't say anything about having tried to meet with the Minister Casey, nor about anyone in the government not having been willing to meet with us. An NDP staffer called me yesterday evening to advise of today's question, invite me to the legislature to view in question period, and to check some facts and wording with me. The wording she ran by me did not include the little dig at the minister about meeting with us, and I was completely taken off guard when I heard the supplementary question from the gallery this afternoon, end of quote. Mr. Speaker, I wish to table a copy of the entire correspondence.
Is there any response?
No, there's no response. We got the proof there.
The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, we will take the correspondence under advisement and respond to it in such manner.
It is a point.
You got something to say, Percy? Stand up. Stand up. Get to your feet.
It does not seem to me that this is a point of order, but it is a point of information. The information has been shared, and obviously we are tabling the issue. The Honourable the Minister of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier on during agenda item resolutions, the NDP's member for Halifax Atlantic submitted a resolution. I have the therefore be it resolved here. Mr. Speaker, it speaks to the health of all citizens, and it's alleging that the actions of the government are reprehensible and are taking risks with people's health. And Mr. Speaker, I'd asked if you would review that resolution and advise the House as to whether or not that resolution is in order. I simply would make that request, and thank you, Speaker.
We will review that, and we will get back to the House at the earliest convenience. The Honourable the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call to the order of business public bills for second reading?
Public bills for second reading.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please call Bill number 240, the Offshore Offset Revenue Expenditure Act?
Bill number 240, the Offshore Offset Revenues Expenditure Act. The Honourable the Minister of Finance. Order.
Mr. Speaker,
I would request that the members of the House remind that we are all honourable members. People are going to get the opportunity to speak on this item and to give some respect to whatever individual is on the floor and has the floor. Everyone will have an opportunity in given time to respond. So please show the respect that you would like to be shown to yourself. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Oh, thank you very much, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to be quite candid, it is with mixed emotions that I'm on my feet to speak to second reading of the Offshore Offset Expenditure Act, Bill number 240. It is a bill of some consequence for two reasons. First of all, if this bill is not passed by this House, then unless the leaders of the other two parties and their colleagues agree, the budget will not be tabled. Secondly, it is a bill which kind of illustrates the serious financial difficulty that the province finds itself in the year 2009-2010. Mr. Speaker, most of us in the government caucus were here in 2005 when the Offshore Offset Expenditure Act was put into force. Indeed, it was supported by all members of the House. And in 2005, it was clearly the right thing to do. And getting the financial business of the province was something of which this government, getting the financial affairs of the province in the shape that we can perhaps withstand the economic downturn as well as we are, is something of which not only the MacDonald government but the Ham government members are very proud. And Mr. Speaker, it's something that we have talked about and been very actively around the province. So, Mr. Speaker, what I'm trying to tell the members of this House and the members, people in Nova Scotia, is that for government to go off that course, that was in some ways, a pillar of the Conservative government, something very, very dramatic had to change in the finances of this province. What it meant, Mr. Speaker, if this change is not accepted, there are going to be programs and services that are dear to all Nova Scotians. There are going to be numerous people laid off in the civil service, public service. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition says I'm making that up. But what I'd like to know is where he is going to get that revenue to make it up. You know, we haven't heard that yet.
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable the Minister of Finance has the floor.
I don't know, Mr. Speaker. One of the other things I suppose that could have been done, the Honourable Member from Halifax Atlantic read a resolution which probably shouldn't have been read in this House. But you know, there are 5 helicopters out there fighting that fire at the present time. I suppose we could have taken 2 of those and put them on the ground. You know, that's the type of thing, Mr. Speaker, that is going to have to happen. That is the type of thing, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please.
Drawing a link between this bill and that fire is disgraceful. Oh, listen to
Order, please.
That's unbelievable. Yeah, good one.
Everybody will get an opportunity to speak. The Honourable the Minister of Finance has the floor.
I think so, yeah. We'll do that, yeah. Mr. Speaker, getting back to the Act, I was using a couple of examples that obviously people didn't want to hear, but I said simply as illustrate the types of things that might have to happen. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I was trying to illustrate is that the government has to make rather, has some severe choices to make. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to go back through a little bit of history of debt reduction and what has happened the past number of years in our province. First of all, I don't think most people understand that in Nova Scotia we're a little bit unique. We're different than any other province in Canada in our definition of deficit and surplus. Mr. Speaker, when we are talking about using the offshore offset monies and bringing them in the revenues so we can fund operations, does not mean that the province would not end the year in a surplus situation. It would still be in a surplus situation, just as the surplus is smaller. You know, we're arguing about the size of a surplus, not whether they're going to be in surplus, whether the books are going to be balanced or not, according to GAAP. We will have more revenue than we are expending. And for 9 other provinces and 2 territories, 3 territories, you know, Mr. Speaker, that's balanced books. Just happens that in our situation, because of the, of the conditions that were in effect because of the good government, in 2005, we were able not only to negotiate that money, but we were in a position at that time to legislate that it go to the surplus and then flow to the debt, Mr. Speaker, and that is, that was a remarkable accomplishment. But 2005 and 2009 are 2 different years. You know, they are 2 different years. Now, I see the Honourable Member from Halifax Citadel over there, Sable Island. He's saying, well, he's got 4 universities in his constituency, yet he does not want money to flow to those universities for capital improvement. You know. Now, Mr. Speaker, I did start some time ago to talk about the debt reduction we have here in Nova Scotia. And for the members of the House that you probably don't know that, Nova Scotia has implemented a number of measures in the past 8 years, first to slow the growth of the debt and then to produce surplus in each year to reduce it. Reducing the net direct debt requires ending the year in a surplus position with revenues higher than expenditures and not having the change in the net book value of tangible capital assets exceed the surplus. The 2005 debt reduction plan was a major step in debt reduction in that year, and Nova Scotia put $830 million from the federal offshore offset payment onto the debt. A portion of this offset is recognized as revenue for accounting purposes for a total of 8 years. The debt reduction plan included a policy commitment to have the debt decline beginning in 2007-2008. In 2007 and 2008, the debt declined by $242 million plus dollars. The net direct debt stood at $12.15 billion as of March 31st, 2008. Debt servicing costs have dropped relative to revenues from 19.9% in 2001-2002 to 10.9% in 2007-2008. That's about a 50% decline. Now, I know that the people on the other side of the house aren't very good with numbers, but if you take 20 and subtract 10 from it, you get 10, and that's about half. The provincial debt as a percentage of gross domestic product has dropped from 48.7% in 1999-2000 to 36.7% for 2007-2008. The stimulus plan which we are proposing will indeed result in a net direct debt, an increase in net direct debt. However, the increase will be manageable within a net direct debt to GDP ratio framework. Mr. Speaker, yesterday afternoon, I talked about the stimulus package and the fact that the government is going to borrow money to put into that stimulus package. I gave some figures yesterday afternoon, and just for clarity, because we do have some slow learners on the other side of the house, I want to go through this again. And I've rounded these numbers off, Mr. Speaker, to make it even a little bit easier. The provincial debt right now is around $12 billion. We have about $8 billion of deferred maintenance. So, excuse me, yeah.
A point of order. Mr. Speaker, you know, it's one thing for the minister to have his point of view on this particular piece of legislation, but I don't think hurling insults enhances this debate. I also think that some of the insults he's hurling are very offensive to certain groups of people in our community who have had to deal with the stigma of those kinds of slurs. And the minister, as a former educator, should be very well aware of that, Mr. Speaker. So I would ask you to find as unparliamentary the latest slur from the minister.
I don't believe that is a point of order. It's more like a point of information. The Honourable the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, it was not my intent to offend the honourable member or any other thing. And rather than using that word, perhaps I say they're slow to have a slow uptake on when it comes to numbers. Mr. Speaker, the provincial debt of $12 billion, an outstanding deferred maintenance of about $8 billion, and it gives roughly a total of about $20 billion. Now, Mr. Speaker, the stimulus package, which we are proposing, and by the way, just for the information of members on the other side of the House, until the budget is passed, TCA spending in this province is now, we're out of room. So you can mull that one over too. Mr. Speaker, we have about $1.4 billion. We're going to roughly $1.4 billion in the stimulus package, and that would increase the debt to about $13.4 billion. I'm sorry, what did I say? 1.9. Yeah, 1.9 in the stimulus package. 1.4 is coming from the provincial government, and that's going to increase to about 13.4. We have outstanding deferred maintenance of about $8 billion. Now, the deferred maintenance is going to be reduced by the amount of the stimulus package, roughly. So, effectively, if we're putting $1.9 billion into stimulus, which is basically capital projects, then we can subtract that deficit. That should come off the infrastructure deficit. So, Mr. Speaker, that would mean at the end of that three-year stimulus period that the infrastructure deficit would be reduced from $8 billion to a little over $6 billion. Mr. Speaker, if you add it up, the 2009-2010, because if you add together the infrastructure deficit and the net direct debt, we're up to about $20 billion. At the end of that three-year period, if we use that stimulus money and add both the net direct debt and the infrastructure debt together, Mr. Speaker, the actual debt has been reduced by $500 million. It will come out to about $19.5 billion. So, Mr. Speaker, using that money for stimulus is not only going to keep, about 20,000 people working or giving a better part of 20,000 people jobs, Mr. Speaker, it is, in real terms, going to help the financial situation of the province. Now, Mr. Speaker, although this piece of legislation is very small, it does have significant implication for the people of Nova Scotia. I said for two reasons. First of all, in how much money will be available for programs and services. And secondly, the time it's going to take if we don't get a stimulus package out the door. It is going to have a whole lot of things. Now, Mr. Speaker, what really we would like to do is to have the opposition parties pass this piece of legislation and pass the budget. Or, Mr. Speaker, pass this piece of legislation so that the budget can be tabled and you can vote on the budget. You can see the plan which we are proposing. And if it doesn't, not up to your standards or something that you would like, then go ahead and vote against it. That's what this House is all about. Parties and people make up their mind whether they're going to support legislation or they're not going to support legislation. Mr. Speaker, to make these statements in advance like the member of the Liberal Party or the leader of the Liberal Party has and the leader of the NDP and basically both term thumbs down before, although I must say the leader of the New Democratic Party said he wanted to enter debate on this particular matter. It's really what we have to look at is what is in the best interests of the people of Nova Scotia. It's not what's in the best interests of the member from Richmond or the member from Glace Bay or from Halifax Needham or from Halifax Fairview or even Pictou West. Mr. Speaker, it's what right now and this time, and I'm talking this time, I'm talking in this next 2 or 3 weeks, what is best for the people of Nova Scotia. We want to forget about whether I'm a progressive conservative whether I am a Liberal or I am a member of the New Democratic Party. What we remember is we are all Nova Scotians, and right now, Mr. Speaker, we have to be interested in the welfare of our party as opposed to the welfare of our province as opposed to the welfare of our party. You know, Mr. Speaker, this is a time to put partisan politics aside. This is a time to look at the issue. It's a time to look at the issue, Mr. Speaker. It's a time to say, listen, folks, we've got 20,000 jobs more or less on the line. We've got an infrastructure package out there for universities. We have an infrastructure package out there for municipalities. We have an infrastructure package out there for roads, which we are not going to be able to fully access. All of this has considerable portion of money which is coming from the federal government, and we aren't going to be able to make full use of that if this piece of legislation is not passed and we get at that budget. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, you know, we have to get at the business and work in the best interests of our province. You know, unfortunately, one reason or another, maybe we're all responsible for it in this House. We've allowed the economic situation in Nova Scotia, which means that we have to change the way we do business to become a political thing, rather than a thing in the interests of Nova Scotia. You know, it's, we've gotten down to that. Now, I'm going to challenge the people on the opposite side of the House. Challenge people on the opposite side of the House. Pass this legislation. Pass this legislation. Let a budget be tabled. Let a budget be tabled. So the honourable member from Richmond can go back home and tell the people in his constituency, you know something, I protected. I helped protect your jobs. Or I helped create some jobs in my constituency. Go home and tell your folks that. But you could go home and you could say, hey, I just voted against jobs in my constituency. Or we can go to the member from Hants East. And he can go out and tell the people.
He had a petition today.
He had a petition to roads, a petition for roads. But yet, if he votes against this legislation, votes against the budget, he's voting against roads in his constituency. You know, delaying the construction season and all of these things, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this, you know, it's a small piece of legislation. It is extremely important. The dramatic downturn in the economy right across this country and across North America and indeed across the world has made everybody do things differently. In our good friends to the south of us in the United States, they virtually own several banks now, and they own half the automobile industry now. You know, and they had to do things differently. And I don't know why the people in this House, at least on the other side of the House, don't understand that, you know, we have to do different in our province, do things differently in our province. Mr. Speaker, the offshore offset money last year was $105 million, more or less. Now, why do you think that the government, in light of our track record, would take the position that we have to bring that money into ordinary revenue? So, you know, the question is, would we have had a tougher decision to make politically? I don't think the people on the other side of the House understand the challenges that we have. The member from Richmond ought to, because he was in government for a while, stumbling along with a $600 million surplus when they lost office.
June budget.
And a June budget. Forgot about that. Beg pardon? Yeah, I know what it was. Yeah, health investment fund. Health investment fund. Mr. Speaker, I think it's a good thing that I am hearing impaired. I didn't hear what he said. Mr. Speaker, but anyway, what I'm trying to point out is that, this is not, piece of legislation did not come easily. The debate that took place within our caucus to come to this conclusion was hours and hours and hours. Now, I have not heard the other two parties except making these fleeting statements say, oh no, we don't need that offshore offset money. We can do with it. The drop in the bucket. The drop in the bucket. It's, we don't know, and to understand that, if this piece of legislation is not passed, do you know where the next government, which will be us again and we'll be starting from scratch, where we will be? We will be? We are going to be starting, and I want to tell you this, and I want one of you to stand up and tell me how you're going to deal with it. You'll be starting, and I'm going to use rough numbers. You got 105 from last year. Now that will be reduced because when we table the budget on Monday or Tuesday, whenever you allow us to do it, we will show a surplus, and the $105 million from the offshore offset that's required to go to the offshore offset will be diminished, or at least but you know that if you have a deficit budget, it's carried over first charge in the next budget. You understand that? Okay? Now, right now, that offshore offset cannot be counted. It's got to flow directly to the debt, Mr. Speaker. So what it means is that the next budget that will be presented in this House, whether it be by the, and likely will be by the progressive conservative government, whether it would be a liberal government, or whether it would be a new democratic government. Heaven forbid. Mr. Speaker, that government is starting $200 million in the hole. $200 million in the hole. $200 million in the hole. I want to know what programs you are going to reduce, how many civil servants or public servants will be laid off, or how big a deficit you'll be running to make up that $200 million, and that's just a start. That's a start. Now, I know that's next year. We'll worry about that next year. Well, I want to tell you, we've been worrying about this since this year began. We've been working on this for months. We started last September to try and map out a plan that would be the best thing in the interest of all Nova Scotians. Mr. Will you allow us to table the budget on Monday? We will table it. Make that offer. Mr. Speaker, we have a good plan. We were able in our budget to protect the essential programs and services that Nova Scotia want. Well, nobody got what they wanted. Nobody got what they wanted. And I want to tell you that if this bill is not passed, people are going to get a lot less than they wanted. A lot less than they wanted. We were able to come up with a plan which protected the essential services of Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, in 2005 it was good. We had 3 or 4 real good years financially in this province. The offshore royalties were great. Federal revenues were great. We got Crown share. We got the Atlantic Accord. I mean, we had. We still have it. But the question is to you: do you want to borrow money to put on the debt? Yeah. Not looking over. He understands this. He understands this. Certainly does. I mean, he's, you know, he's unfortunately, he's a member of a team, and you know, well, most of the time. You know, I get, you know, the people get up and they wax eloquently about all of these great things they're going to do, Mr. You know, folks, and I'm looking at the New Democratic Party because they've been the ones that have, you know, been making most of the promises, and I think our people say you got about $2 billion in promises out there. You know, and somebody said it went up by $150 million yesterday, but you know, you can either raise taxes dramatically, you can run a deficit, or you can cut programs and services and lay people off. You know, you cannot, and I'm telling you this, there is no way, unless you better go down and buy a Powerball lottery ticket and hope it runs to $500 million and you got the winning number. There is no way those promises that have been made by the New Democratic Party can be met within the financial means of this province, Mr. Speaker. You know, we talk about la-la land from time to time, and you know, and I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, you know, financially, it just, and I know, I look at the member from Halifax Fairview, he knows it's true. The member from Halifax Buckner knows it's true. They know. They know. And, you know, what I'm saying is we got to separate politics from policy, which is good for Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, we did not want to introduce this legislation. Heaven knows I was beside, as was Minister McIsaac and Minister Parent and everybody. You know, we were all there, and we were beside the former Premier, and how proud we were to make that decision in 2005. And 2005 and 2010 and 2009, unfortunately, are different times. And, Mr. Speaker, I say that again, and I repeat it, just so that people will understand the magnitude of what the decision that you are making today, or will make on Monday, or will make on Tuesday. It is not, you know, if you don't support this legislation, you know, as I said, you've got choice. You can raise taxes, you can cut programs and services, you can lay off 4,000 people. That'll, you know, that'll give you $200 million. Or you can raise taxes for $200 million. Yet you're going to reduce taxes. You know, the leader of the NDP went so far, and I think it was the March 28th edition of the Halifax Herald, he was not only going to balance the budget, he was going to reduce the net direct debt, I think was going to have a stimulus package, and add $2 billion worth of promises. Mr. Speaker, you know, I know sometimes when you speak politically, people in this House, we all make mistakes on things we say. You know, we make statements, we get caught up in rally talk or political talk or something like that. But, Mr. Speaker, you know, I think the problem with it is that I think they believe that. You know, some of them believe it. No, I know there are some that don't because they know better. You know, Mr. Speaker, it's just, you know, those things just aren't realistic. And they're going to be even more unrealistic, Mr. Speaker, for all of us if we don't pass this piece of legislation. I'm not going to characterize this as good legislation. I don't want to do that because for me, it's necessary legislation. You know, it's something that has to be done given the situation that we're in. Heaven knows, you know, certainly nobody on these benches, you know, we would really like that this, like the conditions to be such that this province could protect programs and services and still make that debt payment. The offshore. I used an example when I spoke up at the Halifax Board of Trade the other day. And I talked about a personal example, and I'll put it on the table here again. When I was in the education business, I don't know, it must have been for 10 or 15 years, I taught summer school every summer, and I used to teach night school classes during the winter. And I taught all across Canada, and I did 5 or 6 terms up the University of Cape Breton University, and there was hardly anybody I didn't work for, of the maritime universities at one time or another. Mr. Speaker, and what I used to do with that summer school money was, I had a mortgage on my house, and I used to make an extra payment on the mortgage with that summer school money. Good thing to do, because I had that money coming in every year, so for a number of years I made that extra payment on the mortgage. And you know what happened? I did, absolutely. And do you know what happened, though? One of my children needed orthodontic work. I didn't have orthodontics in my budget. Sorry, excuse me, David. I didn't have orthodontic work in my budget. Do you know what I did with that summer school check? I gave it to the orthodontist because I had ongoing expenses. And I think for my family, that was a better investment than putting it on my mortgage, than borrowing money to pay for the orthodontist. It was a better investment. You know something? I had 2 children go to the orthodontist. So I not only missed one payment, I missed a number of payments. Now, I was able at the same time to make my regular mortgage payments. But, you know, and that's the situation the province finds itself in today. Do you borrow money to meet your operating expenses, or do you make the extra mortgage payment? What do you want to do? You've got that money sitting there. Our debt costs right now are manageable. In the past 10 years that we've been in government, the gross revenues of this province have increased roughly by about 100%. Our debt has not kept pace. We have those numbers, and that's why I read those numbers to you at the beginning, is that our debt servicing costs as a proportion of our economy have gone down in those 10 years. Mr. Speaker, we want to keep the province on a sound financial footing. Mr. Speaker, we can manage those debt costs right now. But the other thing about running a deficit, and I guess you got your choice, run a deficit or you pay your bills. We haven't run a deficit for 7 years, and if you allow us to table budget, you're going to see we're not going to do it for an 8th. Then, you really debate it on Monday? Not that I dispute the member from Halifax, Fairview, and the member from Pictou West, but we would be happy to have a consultation with your House Leader and your party leader to allow that very thing to occur. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, getting back to the issue in here is that, once you start to run a deficit, and this was one of the things that we literally considered. Should we run a deficit, or should we use this kind of savings money that we have, that extra mortgage payment, so we don't have to run a deficit? If you run a deficit, and I can tell you how it works now, you people, with the exception of the member from Richmond, have never had the opportunity to go through this experience. And he probably never will again. But, Mr. Speaker, that is a certainty, yes. Thank you, yeah. Anyway, for those who are listening, I'm not running again. So. You sit around the caucus and the cabinet table, and you have to make decisions. And, one of the conversations, and I know I'm breaking kind of cabinet solidarity by saying this, is that, one of the suggestions that came out and said, well, let's run a deficit and say we're going to attribute the deficit to health. or we're going to attribute the deficit to education, or we're going to attribute it to economic development or community services. Pick one of the departments. And then my good friend from Kings North, who is, has a justice center. He needs a justice center rebuilt down there in Kentville. And I see the member from Kings West, he's nodded and said, you agree to that, right? Okay. Now, all I'm saying is that to say what they're saying is that, okay, if you run a big deficit for natural resources, why don't you add another $20 million on it so I can do the project in health? Or then the person from from health promotion comes along and say, well, we got a great big public relation program we want to do about healthy living. Why don't you add $10 million on for that? And we get down into education. She said, look, you know, there are a whole lot of things need to be done in education. Look, just give me $15 million and we can fix that. And all of a sudden, that $20 or $30 million deficit becomes a $100 or $200 million deficit. When you have a deficit, where do you stop? And that's what got this province into a difficulty it is now. And New Democratic, I think. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I've gone on long enough. I just about, but I don't want to. Just want to remind the members of the opposite party is that your leader is on record as saying he is committed to balancing the budget and not increasing the debt. He also, which kills stimulus plan, by the way. Also, you know as a party the promises that you have out there, and you know how much those things are going to cost. Folks, look, I'm just telling you, you got to pull back because what you've proposed is simply not within the financial means of this province. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I'll recognize the honourable member from Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I may be permitted an introduction. In your gallery today is Mr. Ryan Watson, who is the leader of the Nova Scotia Green Party and also a candidate in Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, and I want to welcome him to the House.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On a day when we are debating an important finance bill, I have to say that I, like all members of the House, am acutely conscious of the person who is not here. I would like to start my remarks today with my own tribute to the late Michael Baker. I had hoped to do this as part of my reply to the budget speech, but as things are unfolding, it appears that I may not have the opportunity to do that. I have been the opposition finance critic for over 7 years now, and over that time, Mr. Speaker, I have dealt with a number of very fine people who have held the position of Minister of Finance, the Honourable Neil LeBlanc, the Honourable Peter Christie, the late Honourable Michael Baker, and now the Honourable Jamie Moore. Oh, I'm sorry, he is the current member of the House. The Honourable current Minister of Finance, who has announced he's not reoffering an election, and so I thank him for his service as well. But Michael Baker, as we all know, was a particularly fine gentleman, a vigorous advocate for his own point of view, the point of view of the government. His contributions inside the House were always incisive and important and worth listening to, and dealing with him outside the House, whether it was in his role as the government House leader or otherwise, was always a pleasure because you couldn't always get your way with Michael, but you knew that you were being listened to, and you knew that whatever position he was putting forward was well thought out and well grounded. And as his illness took hold, I think we all saw in him a certain, what you might call a serenity that came very much to the fore as he dealt with his challenges and his family, and continued, as was said in the House by the party leaders yesterday, continued to be completely devoted to his work as a public servant. And I know that we do all miss the late Honourable Michael Baker very much. And this is and we think of him particularly because this bill which we're debating this morning and which may trigger an election is a finance bill. And in a way, Mr. Speaker, it's a bit of an oddity, because if I read the bill or read the operative clause of the bill, there is not one single Nova Scotian who will understand what this means, and yet this clause may trigger an election. I'm just going to read the operative clause of the bill, Mr. Speaker. It reads, clauses 76A, 1, D, E, and F, and subsection 76A, subsection 2 of Chapter 365 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Provincial Finance Act, are repealed. That's what it says. Now, I don't think that the Conservative Party is going to put this bill in its campaign literature and say, look what the opposition couldn't accept, because it's very difficult for most people to understand. And yet this bill, the government says, must pass before the annual budget is even introduced. Now, this is unprecedented, in my view, in Nova Scotia. Certainly unprecedented in the time that I have closely followed Nova Scotia politics, which is now 11 years, and I've been in the House for 8. For 2.5 years before that, I was Director of Research for the NDP caucus, so I followed things closely. Certainly unprecedented in my 11 years around politics. As far as I know, from all I have heard and read about the history of Nova Scotia politics, it is unprecedented that a government should come to this House and set a condition for the introduction of its budget, and to say to the opposition parties, you must agree to this condition or we will not even introduce our budget. Now, that resolution that the Minister of Finance introduced yesterday, the budget resolution, I am willing to bet, for the first time in Nova Scotia's history, does not set a budget date. That resolution, which is required by the rules and has a set form, always stipulates the date on which the budget will be presented. And yesterday it did not. And why not, Mr. Speaker? Because the government says that the opposition must pass this bill first before the budget is introduced. That is unprecedented in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I challenge the government to find any precedent for that anywhere in Canada or